Welcome to my Survivor Tour. My name is Jim Gonzalez, and I will be taking you on a tour very shortly. Before we go out, I wanted to preface it with a few thoughts. First of all, I want to create a binary encoded version of this story, which we're doing right now. Second, I've been doing this for over 7.5 years, and I've shared my story and heard other stories with other survivors, firefighters, and family members. And there's one common thing that I have learned in doing these tours, and that is that the victims did not live ordinary lives. Their lives were not ordinary. My life is not ordinary, nor is yours. Where we're standing on Greenwich Street, you can't see it from where we are right now, but about a half a mile down is Battery Park. And we used to be able to see the Koenig sphere, which was an abstract globe that sat in the center of the World Trade Center. It got severely damaged during the attacks and was moved to a different location down there now. It's near the Eternal Flame. It's a 20-foot in diameter abstract globe, and to me, it has a personal connection. Because I do not believe that these attacks had anything to do with religion, nor do I think they had anything to do with the United States policy in the Middle East. I think they were perpetrated by nothing more than a bunch of murderous thugs whose only intent was to destroy the modern world that we live in right now. Less than 2 miles from where we're standing right now is Ellis Island, a former immigration center and now a national park, where over 100 years ago, both sets of my grandparents emigrated, both maternal and paternal grandparents emigrated from the country of Lithuania to the United States. They did not come here with the intent of seeing their descendants and their grandson go back to the Dark Ages. I can assure you we are not going back. If you want to confirm my theory, try taking a cell phone away from a teenager and let me know how well you deal with that maneuver. I have yet to see that happen. Let me begin. I will tell you that I read quite a bit of my story. I've always wanted to capture the right words, so you'll see me looking down. So let me begin by doing that. It has been said that someone who has had a near-death experience begins to understand life more. I am one of those people. I will always attempt, but always fail, to make my 9/11 story about life, not death. My name is Jim Gonzalez, and I will be taking you out onto the memorial in a few minutes. I am a survivor and was working on the 67th floor of the South Tower. 9/11 is so important it has become an official language in most English language dictionaries, an official word in most English language dictionaries. You can turn on your TV tonight and you will hear the word 9/11 more than once, and it's been over 13 years since the tragedy. Behind me is the 1010 firehouse. 6 firefighters from there died on 9/11. What you're looking at is a 56-foot long bronze bas-relief donated by the legal firm of Holland & Knight, memorializing all 343 New York City firefighters plus 1 private citizen. While over 2 billion people were witnessing this tragedy unfold on TV, many viewers wish they could magically transport themselves into the towers to help. At the same time, a volunteer firefighter named Glenn Winnick did run into the towers to help and lost his life. As a highly compensated partner in a high-profile legal firm, Mr. Winnick might seem to have had everything. He could have stayed in his office at 195 Broadway and watched the events unfold on TV along with his co-workers, but that was not part of his character. The immediate aftermath of 9/11, over 500,000 people followed Mr. Winnick's path and volunteered to work here. There was a tsunami of human compassion driven by the need to help our fellow man. Wouldn't it be nice if we could duplicate that spirit of volunteerism again without the tragedy? If you want a sense of how high the towers were, directly across the site is the rebuilt 7 World Trade Center. It's 52 stories high. the building on the right. Double it and add 6 more stories for a total of 110 stories, or 1,350 feet. To its left is the new One World Trade Building, formerly known as the Freedom Tower. Its structural height is 1,368 feet. They've also added a 408-foot spire on top of it, and if you combine that total, it adds up to 1,776 feet, which is symbolic of the founding of the United States of America, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The original Twin Towers were designed by Minoru Yamasaki for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and Mr. Yamasaki suffered from acrophobia. It was a fear of heights, but he used his fear of heights in designing the World Trade Center. Windows were 22 inches wide, floor to ceiling. You had to almost press your face against the window to see down, and when you did look down, both your hands pressed against the support, giving you a strong sense of security at every height. Does anyone know why they stopped building at 110 stories? You cannot feel it today, but the answer is wind. The design of the Twin Towers would be highly affected by wind, and they would sway as much as 11 inches in the wind. When they were designing the Twin Towers, they invited people to a free eye exam in a trailer that was on a hydraulic platform. The platform would move back and forth, but they did not tell the examinees that the platform was moving. The examinees had to tell the optometrist that he or she sensed movement. The engineers wanted to see how much sway caused by wind load would be noticed by people. Could not distract tenants from their daily task in an office environment. If they did anything like that today, there'd be free eyeglasses and lawsuits galore for everybody. But back in the 1950s and 60s, when they were designing the Twin Towers, they didn't have the computer models for doing so. I think it's kind of a unique way of doing that. If you wanted things I remember about windy days in the World Trade Center, if you were high enough in the tower, had a round pencil, placed it on your desk, it would roll off your desk. Doors would sometimes automatically close, and if you went into the restroom and looked into the toilet, you would see the water slosh back and forth. Elevators would run at half speed, and that would upset us the most, as that could delay our mass transit connection when we were leaving work. New York City commuters are obsessed and driven by train schedules. And this is the new 4 World Trade. This is going to be the first building to be open on site. I believe New York State offices will be in here. It's being built out now. It's complete with the exception of the build-out process. And what I normally do is I bring people to a spot here. And one of the first things I tell people is that if you look at the ground, you look at the stone, each and every stone, as well as the grass patches and everything, all have the same ratio as the Twin Towers. If you take a closer look. Okay, people always ask me about the airplanes that came here. Both planes that hit the North and South Tower took off from Logan Airport. Logan Airport is in Boston, and I'm facing north right now. Flight 11 would have been taken over by the terrorists and would have went right over the old 7 World Trade Center and would have went directly into the north facade of the North Tower, approximately between the 86th and 94th floors. It would have tilted its wings just prior to going in to create maximum damage. Flight 175 also took off from Logan Airport. That followed a little bit different direction. That went out into western New Jersey, a little bit into Pennsylvania, and would have went right over to where we were standing by the firefighters memorial. That plane hit the South Tower on the south facade, and it would have hit lower, approximately between the 78th floors and the 85th floors. It too would have tilted its wings prior to going in. On the North Tower, it hit directly head on. All 3 stairwells were shattered. Nobody above the North Tower, nobody above the impact zone survived. On the South Tower, it hit slightly at an angle. There was one stairwell open, if you could find it. And 18 people above the impact zone found that stairway and made it down for safety. One of the important points that I want, and this was all deliberate, done by the terrorists, is that they hit from opposite directions into the towers. They were actually trying to topple the towers into themselves, so they thought by hitting high they would kill more people and create more chaos and havoc. That was not the case. If they had hit lower, they would have killed more people. I would not be alive today to tell my story, which is one of the reasons I tell my story. But there's also it's little consolation for the nearly 3,000 people that died that day. But the thing with me is I have a grandson who, well, he doesn't play it anymore, but he used to play a children's game called Connect the Dots. You have a bunch of dots, a sequence of numbers, and you see a larger picture once you connect them all together. And because I'm older now, I begin doing that with my own life. And I begin seeing things that are somehow seem to be all related to each other. And when I was 19 years old, I was a U.S. Marine. I was with the 5th Marine Division in Camp Pendleton, California, the 26th Marines. And they were escalating the war in Vietnam. They placed thousands of us on troop ships to go over there to end the war. That did not happen. But on the way over there, our ship moored at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And we moored right across from the USS Arizona. It's a national monument. It was just opened a few years at that time. It's still a very popular tourist attraction. And I remember me and a couple of my buddies decided to go out and visit it. We were in our tropical uniforms, and we went out there, and it was a veteran from December 7th, 1941, which was when the Empire of Japan attacked the United States Naval Fleet there, and that entered the United States into World War II. But I remember there was a veteran there, and he was holding his hand up in the air, pointing to the direction of the enemy airplanes coming over the horizon. I never thought that 40 years into the future, I would be doing the same thing. Only I'm standing in Lower Manhattan. And trust me, these airplanes on 9/11 were no longer certified flights. They were enemy airplanes. The people on Flight 93 knew they were not on Flight 93. And what was occurring at over 500 miles an hour, tens of thousands of feet in the air, was nothing short than a modern American version of the Alamo taking place. And when that plane came down in the backyards of the good citizens of Somerset County, Pennsylvania, came down in everybody's backyard, which is, I think, why we have so many international visitors here. Even walking through the memorial today, I heard many languages I've never heard before. It was my worst day at work. It was my best day at work in 37 years. The 400 collective days I served in the Vietnam War as a 19-year-old U.S. Marine does not come close to the horror we all experienced in 102 minutes at this location on 9/11. I live in New Jersey and arrived at Hoboken train station at 7:45 in the morning. The weather was so nice I decided to take the ferry to the World Financial Center. The ferry would pass through the shadows of both towers that were cast upon the river for the very last time. I went into the Winter Garden and walked up the marble semicircular staircase and proceeded through the pedestrian bridge. Once I got to the other side, a single side door that a lot of commuters would ignore. I went through this door and I was at the base of the north facade of One World Trade. I have always been an early bird to work. And if I went in on time, I would have been killed by the debris and fuel hitting that north facade by Flight 11. I proceeded to cross the plaza between the Koenig Sphere and the stage for concerts. The vacant white folding chairs in front of the stage were in place for the next show. I entered 2 World Trade at the mezzanine level, went down the escalator to get the elevators to my floor, and arrived at work on the 67th floor of 2 World Trade at 8:05. I sat down at my computer in my cubicle where I did my job as a computer security analyst. At 8:46, I heard a muffled explosion. I stood up and I looked south over my cubicle partition wall towards the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. And I did not see anything, and I discounted it as perhaps an air conditioning or mechanical equipment explosion, something not entirely uncommon in Lower Manhattan. I then heard the hysterical crying of a secretary. When I glanced out the window again, I saw 8.5 by 11 sheets of office paper fluttering and falling outside my window at the 67th floor level. My manager instructed me and others to leave down the stairwell. I put on my jacket, hit Control-Alt-Delete on my computer to lock it, and grabbed my briefcase with expectations to return. Proceeded down to the 44th floor sky lobby where at 9:02 a voice came over the public address system and said a plane had just crashed into One World Trade, but that the integrity of Two World Trade was okay. This message was repeated again. Some people said they were going back to work. Seconds later at 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashed into my building. The entire building shook violently and swayed. My feet went into the air. I prepared to die. I was near an out-of-service elevator, and the force of the impact drove a combination of air and dust into the lobby. And I remember feeling that I did not want my body to be found in an elevator shaft. As I realized I was not yet dead, I picked myself off the floor, but some items from my soft briefcase had scattered on the ground. One item was my rail pass, and I felt I needed it to go home. Pandemonium broke out on the floor, and now everybody began running towards the stairwell. I had to go against the flow of people to retrieve my rail pass. Somehow I got it without being knocked over. Even though there was chaos in the sky lobby, people began helping other people. On the floors high above me, something more extreme was occurring. People were making choices. They had to choose how to die. What used to be an office area was now unrecognizable, filled with debris, fire, smoke, and no way out. When one sees charred, smoldering bodies that can no longer be identified as man or woman, let alone which co-worker he or she was, the choice becomes more apparent. They wanted their bodies to be found and identified. They would jump. Some were seen jumping holding hands, a feat not so easy when you consider that the windows were only 22 inches wide. They must have planned in some detail how they would exit both the window and their lives. Now, even though I was not on those upper floors, nobody lived who was there. But I felt somebody must make an attempt to tell a small portion of their story. Once I got to the stairwell, it did not take long for movement down to stop. The World Trade Center was never designed to handle a mass evacuation, and we did not know whether the plane hit above or below us. People began to panic and push. In what may have only been a minute or two, but what seemed like eternity, we would resume the descent down. Finally, the last door opened to the mezzanine level in a lobby, and we still had to go one more level down. People were backing up at the top of the escalators. Security guards prevented people from going out into the plaza and even tried to keep us from looking there. But as we were waiting our turn to descend, our eyes were drawn to the devastation in the plaza. There was charred debris everywhere I looked. Later I would learn I was not only looking at debris, but also human remains, some still in their airplane seats with their seatbelts on. As my mind raced, a huge outside building support encased in stainless steel came crashing to the ground with both ends on fire. I was looking at steel on fire. My mind had difficulty processing what my eyes were seeing. As I went through the revolving doors to exit the tower perimeter, a group of about 6 New York City firefighters were trying to get inside. A building service person was trying to open the revolving doors so they could get through with their equipment, some of which weighed between 30 and 70 pounds. The service person was struggling with the doors, and then the tall leader shouted in a forceful manner, "Hurry up." The door opened. They now had 75 floors to climb, and unknowingly would never reach their goal. I was now in a concourse heading towards the northeast corner of the World Trade Center. And to exit, I had to walk up the escalator by 5 World Trade. A plainclothes policeman was stationed at the door, kept continuously repeating, "Do not stop, do not look up." He knew we wanted to do both. He did not want this important exit obstructed. As I got outside, there were people lying on the ground bleeding and EMT personnel tending to them. I crossed Church, then walked up Fulton Street. When I turned around, I braced myself for what I was about to see by grabbing the ancient iron fence that wraps around St. Paul's churchyard. I stared in bewilderment at both 1 and 2 World Trade. I saw the gaping holes made by the impact of both airplanes. After 2 or 3 minutes looking, I said my wife's name. Kathleen. I proceeded walking up Broadway, looking for an open payphone, or perhaps I could borrow someone's cell. The payphone line said 20 or more people, and all the restaurants and stores seemed closed. I saw several smashed cell phones on the ground, probably the result of no service. There were no vehicles moving at all, just people either walking north in the center of the streets or standing in the streets, staring at the towers. When 2 World Trade collapsed at 9:59, I was still walking north. I heard a rumble. I turned around to just briefly see the top 2 World Trade disappear. I was not caught in the dust windstorm that was produced by the pancaking of 110 stories in about 10 seconds. 29 minutes later, the same horrific scene would be repeated. People were either fainting or crying in the streets. I still continued walking north when I noticed something frightfully familiar. I was at the very base of the Empire State Building. I am now at what was potentially the next terrorist target that day. How thoughtless to jeopardize my life twice in one day. Picked up the pace and cut across 42nd Street, where I found an open restaurant with a working phone and nobody in line waiting to use it except me. But I want to take you back in time to another story. Right after the first plane hits the first building, the North Tower, but before it hits 2 World Trade. Across the Hudson River in Jersey City, directly behind a Colgate clock in an office building, my wife Kathleen was at her job at 7 a.m. that morning. At 5 minutes to 9, someone came into her office and said the World Trade Center was on fire. She went to the outdoor parking garage with her co-workers, having a full view of what was to happen. At 9:02, she saw Flight 175 fly by the Statue of Liberty, flying erratically at low altitude and at high speed. She did not associate this airplane with the fire in 1 World Trade. When the plane hit 2 World Trade and the massive fireball unfolded, engulfing the building I worked in, she let out a primal scream that had my name embedded in it. She had to be escorted back to her desk, where for 2 hours and 17 minutes her hand was frozen to the telephone, waiting for my phone call. When I did call Kathleen, the phone call itself did not last for more than 30 seconds, and we were talking over each other's words. When I had received the phone bill 1 month later, I noticed I made that call exactly at 11:20 a.m. On every anniversary of 9/11 since, at 11:20, I call her and I say, "It's me, I'm okay, and I love you." I've not missed one of those yet. I found my way down to the Hudson River, where New York Waterways has their ferries docked. Bus terminals were closed, subways and bridges. The only way to cross the Hudson River was by boat. There must have been thousands of people in line waiting to get the ferry. Everything and everybody was still. It was like a silent Woodstock. I had a radio in my briefcase and turned it onto a news station. Just about everybody near me could hear it. After 15 minutes, I turned the radio off. I expected someone to yell at me to turn it back on. Not a single person did. When I did catch the ferry, I was fortunate that it was not only crossing the Hudson River, but it was going to Hoboken train terminal, where I started my day. As I got off the ferry, policemen were asking if anyone had worked specifically in the World Trade Center. They were directing us to a certain area. I expected to be interrogated about the events of the day, perhaps by the FBI, but instead I was in front of a man in a full-body white chemical suit and respirator who was holding a fire hose. Even though no one in our group had been caught in the dust windstorm and had no contaminants on us, the bureaucracy of the moment dictated that we were to be hosed down, like it or not. I was given a white towel to dry myself off, although it doesn't do much good with wet clothes on. Finally, the train I got on left the station, and I ended up only 1 town away from where I started the day. I called Kathleen, who had already been home, to come and get me. While I waited for her, there was a pastry shop next to the phone. I always remember the joy and innocence of eating Italian ices in the summer as a young boy. Did not feel like eating anything, but I knew I had to do something that would start to get my life back on track. Others would have a much more difficult time. 9/11 was on a Tuesday. I went back to work that Friday at Harborside Terminal, directly across the Hudson River in New Jersey, near where Kathleen works. The company moved us a total of 4 times in a 1-year period. I would also like to highlight that there were fellow IT employees who left the World Trade Center that day, walked north to the backup facility uptown, and continued to do their normal job. That, to me, demonstrates the importance of computers in our modern world. The company also provided free catered hot breakfasts and lunches right in the office space for months. There was on-site psychological counseling available daily, and there were long lines waiting to use it. Employees wanted evacuation drills daily, but with Rick Riscola gone, we would settle for anything. I would have lucid nightmares for 6 weeks, every night without fail. Lucid nightmares are the worst kind of nightmares. You cannot tell whether you are sleeping or awake. Lying in bed at night and looking out my bedroom window, I kept seeing the image of defoliated trees covered in ash and dust and draped with computer printouts. And I probably still suffer from survivor's guilt, and now realize some of that guilt originated from the Vietnam War. But rather than give a therapist $100 an hour for listening to my story, I do these tours instead. I have since moved on to a new employer in New Jersey. Also, I have stopped making the mashed potatoes on my dinner plate the shape of the Twin Towers. Now, does anybody know what movie I stole that scene from? That was my bad attempt at humor to try to lift you out of the abyss that I have taken you in. It's a fairly recent movie, 1977, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Richard Dreyfuss in a famous scene where he was obsessed with going to a place and it begins him making his mashed potatoes in the shape of that place. Now, a lot of people on my tour, occasionally the older folks might remember the movie, they get it, the younger people don't, but I had one person on my tour who started to give me a recipe for making my mashed potatoes stiffer. So that person did not get it. I did not have the heart to tell him the rest of the story. Before the memorial opens up, every morning the foundation will come out here and place a white rose on every victim's birthday. And that's what you see right over there. So we want to maybe try to get a shot at that as well. Now what I usually do is I start telling people that this is the South Pole. This is in the exact footprint of the old South Tower, but one exception, it's a little bit smaller. What all of these people don't realize is it's the tree line that's right behind them that's the exact footprint of the South Tower. So every one of these individuals is standing within the footprint of the South Tower. And to me, that's an important point. This is Glenn Winnick. Jericho Fire, he's the only volunteer firefighter that's acknowledged in this way on all of the memorial, and it's because his firm contributed that money to the creating of the firefighters memorial. But what I would like to do is to take some water. Let me take some water and then rub it across there. And I'd like to do it with the 3 or 4 names. There were great acts of heroism that day. Everyone who went into those towers after the planes hit, and there were many, deserved to be classified as heroes. But there's one person I wanted to give special recognition and praise to, and that was Rick Riscola, the Director of Security for Morgan Stanley, the firm that I worked for at the time, the South Tower. Morgan Stanley was the largest tenant in the World Trade Center, occupying 23 floors. I did not know Rick personally, but I knew him to say hello. Rick emigrated from Cornwall, England to the United States in the 1960s as a young man just so he could join the United States Army and be sent to the Vietnam War to fight. Now this was at a time in our history when young men were fleeing the United States to avoid conscription, also known as the military draft. He led a platoon through the notorious valley of Ai Drang, where more than 200 American soldiers died. A battlefield photo of him graces the cover of the 1992 best-selling book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young. Rick is featured in a documentary film entitled The Man Who Predicted 9/11. Rick was responsible for our constant drills of evacuation procedures. Even though Morgan Stanley was the largest tenant with about 2,300 people, we lost 13 people, including Rick, to the tragedy that day. Rick was last seen going up the stairs, not down. A real American hero, and yet he was not even born or raised here. What you're looking at is there are 6 categories of names on the South Tower. 3 of the 4 flights are located over here. The Pentagon, which had 184 victims, they're located over here. All the first responders are over here, as well as the people who were visiting or working in the South Tower. So there's 6 groupings of names here. The firefighters, first responders, they get a little bit more because they get an indication of the ladder company and engine company that they were with. All the names are arranged in, first of all, you'll notice they're not in columns. They wanted each name to stand out by itself. The names are actually engraved all the way through the bronze to show you that there is something missing. And all of the names are placed in what they call meaningful adjacencies. In other words, the person above and below and to the left and right have some kind of connection to each other. It took the foundation years to kind of figure out how to place these names just right. They are not placed alphabetically. Now what you'll see too is that you see this was designed by Michael Arad, and you'll see individual rivulets of water dropping 30 or 32 feet, and then they kind of come together and then disappear into a void. And the reason they selected 30 and 32 feet is because they tested to see exactly where the water would start coming together when it fell. They had a test facility up in New England somewhere to make sure that, and then everything disappears into a void. It describes the collapse of the towers so well. It's massive, it's beautiful. At night, the lights actually come up from underneath the names. It's even more beautiful at night, and of course there's lights coming underneath the waterfalls. Because this is bronze, this conducts heat and cold. Heat in the summer, cold in the wintertime. But they're engineered so that if you place your hand here, it will not burn in the summertime and it will not be cold in the wintertime. It actually freaks tourists out when they come here in January and they place their hand on it and they feel that warmth. They're not expecting it. Right now it's kind of a neutral day, but it's all kind of highly engineered. You'll also notice too that we have access, as any 2-year-old can tell you, we have access to water. And a lot of people who are close to the individuals here who feel connected with them will use the water like I just did in a ceremonial fashion. It's kind of a healing process. Water has been used in ceremonies since before the first organized religion began. I guarantee you that all our ancestors were using it in some way thousands of years ago for cleansing and for ceremonies. In fact, you'll notice that when they send space probes out into other planets, the first thing they look for is not life, but they look for water, because water is basically life. All of the trees on the memorial are all swamp white oaks. They were brought in a distance of 500 miles from New York City, from Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C., except one tree. The one tree behind me, this is a Calorie pear tree. This was discovered between 4 and 5 World Trade in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, a few days after. It was completely decapitated except for one branch. this branch that you see here. You could start to see where the new growth, the post 9/11 growth came, and all of this was prior to 9/11. It was decapitated by the force of the collapse of one of the towers. It would have just taken all of the branches off the top. It was brought up to a nursery in the Bronx where it was nurtured back to health. And 1 year before the memorial was to open, the perfect storm hit the Bronx, and the tree got uprooted. So the moral of the story is, just because you survive one thing doesn't give you a free pass for surviving another. You've heard me mention the Vietnam War. I also happen to be a Vietnam War veteran. I was in the South Tower on 9/11, and yet so many times I've nearly crossed Liberty Street and have been killed by taxi cabs because they don't care that I'm a survivor of both those things. It teaches you also that life has a finite to it. The tree and I will not be on the memorial forever. Memorial will be here a lot longer than outlast us, but for the time being I enjoy telling the story because the story of the tree is also the story of many of us as well. I mentioned Rick Riscola earlier and Glenn Winnick. There's one other name I want you to remember, and that was Betty Ong. She was a flight attendant on Flight 11. And she radioed back to ground control the seat locations of the terrorists on that plane. Before 9/11 begins, the FBI, the United States government, now has a big jump as far as who was causing this, even before it happened. So, and I have done tours here with flight attendants, and I've learned a lot about what they have done, and it's just not serving coffee and tea. They received extensive training in what they did before. They receive, I'm sure, much more now, and we owe a big debt of gratitude to them all. I am reluctant to ask for anything when I travel on an airplane. I just don't want to disturb them at all now. It's just the kind of the way I am. When Silicon Valley was still just a valley filled with nothing but apricot orchards, and before the World Trade Center was here, this location was called Radio Row. Before the phrase high tech, before the word nerd existed, this location was the center of the technological universe for the common man. And I would come here as a 13-year-old boy in 1960. This is where I learned to build electronic equipment from circuit diagrams, not from A to B instruction pamphlets. The salespeople who waited on you were not boys who wore blue or red-colored vests, but older men who wore long-sleeved white shirts and a tie. More often than not, they were engineers who shared their knowledge freely. Generally, there would be a slide rule on the retail counter for those needing deep technical answers. You may wish to Google and see what that ancient device did. But as a result, I self-taught myself electronics, had acquired an amateur radio license that allowed me to communicate to the world from my parents' basement. This was at a time when only about half the homes in the United States had telephones, and in my home the telephone was only used for emergencies or to deliver or receive tragic news. When I graduated high school, I was a little uncertain of what to do with my life. I looked at college course catalogs for electrical electronic engineering, but sitting in front of a drafting board drilling down into design theory did not appeal to me. It was not hands-on enough. At the same time, the Vietnam conflict begins appearing on our black and white television set every night. It was not yet a war, but it was soon coming. So one day I caught a severe case of patriotic fever, and I enlisted unconditionally for 4 years in the United States Marine Corps. If you're looking for a technical career, the last branch of military service you should join would be the Marine Corps, unless, of course, the technical career you're seeking is firing a rifle. And firing a rifle I did well. Out of 66 men in my platoon, I was in a select group of expert qualifiers. I expected to be sent to the Vietnam War as a rifleman. Most men in our platoon did not even qualify with a rifle, yet most would be sent into war as riflemen. But I was also tested in boot camp, and they discovered that I possessed this knowledge of communication and electronics. I was given formal advanced electronic training, and when I go to war, I was assigned to the relative safety of Da Nang Air Base as a communication technician for 13 months. The northern end of Da Nang Air Base was a one-story building isolated from everything and everybody else. and with good reason. It was a grave registration building, which is a military name for mortuary. Every Marine, sailor, soldier, and airman who had fallen in battle would be processed through this facility for their final journey home. The Vietnam War also has a distinction of having the youngest average age serving in any war before or since. 19 years old, teenagers in a war. I would see 2.5-ton trucks in line waiting to unceremoniously remove those fallen in battle and then depart quickly to the battlefields to refill. This image would stay with me for many years, and I would attempt to erase this image with alcohol, but as I and many discovered, alcohol does not erase. Perhaps I felt I could have prevented those bodies being loaded on those trucks with my expert marksmanship instead of being a technician. But when I really think deeply now, I realize I just would have been one of those bodies instead. What pulled me out of my abyss was meeting my wife and filling my life with good things. And I never realized this until after 9/11 when I started doing these tours. I was re-traumatized by the events of 9/11, and these tours forced me to reflect much further back so I could uncover the truth. I believe it is not a coincidence that this early journey would save my life, yet lead me into the computer field, where I nearly died 36 years later in what is considered a physically no-risk field. When I landed my first job as a computer input-output clerk, Bill Gates was 8 years old. People find this hard to believe, but although I had a considerable lead on him in the IT field, he's been a tad more financially successful than me. That's Kathleen inserting her points of view. Tell him why you're going to work tomorrow. But when Radio Row was taken from me, I was heartbroken because I lost something I loved. And for that reason, I did not warm up to the new World Trade Center with its twin towers. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, it was a big call to rebuild the Twin Towers. Well, why not rebuild Radio Row for me, with all its dilapidated warehouse buildings and cornucopia of electronics and components pouring out into the streets? Because that's what I missed and I love. But what will be here will be a vast improvement than what preceded. I do not care if I live to see the last brushstroke on the last coat of paint on the last project to rise around us. In fact, I expect it never to stop. Civilization advances, and history drills deeply into the past. The building directly behind me that's going up there is a Santiago, Calorie, the World Trade Center transit hub. He is a famous Spanish architect. He does not design ordinary buildings, as you can see. This is supposed to resemble a dove leaving a child's hand, and it's actually supposed to open up. But when a financial crisis hit, I believe they figured out it would cost about $500 million to open and close it. So I think it's staying closed permanently. I'm not sure. But what I usually tell people is, you want to take your cameras out now and get the before picture of that building, because once it's up and everybody's in there photographing it, everybody's going to have the same basic picture. So make sure you get a copy of the before picture. Kodak no longer makes film. Humor me, take a picture of it. But I'm also going to tell you right now, the underground portion, the tunnel is open from the PATH train going over to the World Financial Center. The passageway is open, but the stores are not open yet. And that's going to be your public place. It's going to be a destination to come down here. And it's also going to connect all the way up to Fulton Street Center, which they're also building up there. So you're going to have shops, stores, restaurants, bars, places to go, a lot of entertainment, out of the weather. It's absolutely gorgeous. The portion that you go through now, you would think you're inside a whale's stomach when you go down there. Really modernistic, hanging over you. Quite an eye-popper. So if you're into photography, I would suggest you go down there, because I came through there this morning. In 1970, I was a 23-year-old avid New York Ranger hockey fan. It was the best team the Rangers ever assembled. Their first Stanley Cup since 1940 was within reach. Their main rival that year was the Boston Bruins. Hockey fans and hockey players are the most passionate combination of people on earth. As a Ranger fan, I not only rooted for the Rangers, but I rooted against the Bruins as well. After all, isn't the word fan short for fanatic? My mom would be upset when I shouted obscenities while watching hockey games on our TV set at players who were not only doing their job, but doing it well. I hated the Bruins. Derek Sanderson, Wayne Cashman, John McKenzie, and Ace Bailey would bring out the worst in me. I was really bad during the playoffs when the Rangers went down 4-2. The Bruins swept the rest of their way to the Stanley Cup. My hatred peaked. 1982, I switched allegiances to the newly formed New Jersey Devils. In 1994, the Rangers' drought would end with them winning the Stanley Cup. Now my fan base hatred had dimmed in my memory over the years, and all this seemed unrelated until 9/11. A few weeks after 9/11, I was reading stories in the New York Times called Portraits of Greek. Did not think I knew anyone. After all, I received no phone calls. But one of the victims on Flight 175 was 53-year-old Garnet Ace Bailey, director of pro scouting for the Los Angeles Kings ice hockey team. The same Ace Bailey that 3 decades earlier I hated and vilified. The same building that I nearly died in was the same building his flight hit. He and 64 innocent people on that flight would die instantly. In what amounts to a 31-year-long lesson, I have learned that hate is a temporary emotion, and that love is enduring. I still love watching hockey games, but I can no longer direct my hatred towards any individual player. Once our lives touch, we always remain connected. Even you and I are connected. For now, because until we both can no longer love, hate, or even speak. On the evening of December 31st, 1999, I was working at the stroke of midnight on the 67th floor of the World Trade Center South Tower on our computer system. It was known as the Year 2000 Project, also known as Y2K. Everybody who worked that evening was given a flashlight by the Port Authority because it was anticipated that even power grids may fail. The media more than suggested that the modern world would come to an end due to the inability of computerized applications being able to recognize the year 2000. The media was wrong. The world did not end on January 1st of 2000, nor did it end on 9/11, nor is it ending today. On a prior tour, a patron like yourself told me that on 9/11 she was in labor in North Carolina when her daughter Sydney was born between the first and second plane crash. While the entire world was focused on the Twin Towers and the life leaving this world, life was also entering at the same time. The symbolic color of the Tribute Center is blue because of the sky on 9/11. And for me, it carries the additional meaning of the good blue skies that are in my future. I'm nearly 68 years old and older than most anyone here. If I believe I have many good blue skies remaining, imagine how many you have left. Thank you all for joining my Survivor Tour, but more importantly, please enjoy the rest of your visit to this wonderful city. Again, I thank you for viewing this. Thank you.